Hello and warm welcome to the Prague Process Policy Talk, looking into 2023, what migration dynamics and policy developments to expect. Following their two previous policy talks, third time is the charm and third time is tradition. Jean-Louis de Brouwer, Director of the European Affairs Program at the Egmont Institute, and Ralph Genetzke, Director of ICMPD's mission in Brussels, meet again to assess what we learned from 2022 and what we should look at in 2023. My name is Malin Frankenhaeuser. I'm Head of Policy at ICMPD, and it's a pleasure to moderate this talk again for the second year in a row. So we will start by looking back and looking forward at the same time. We will be loosely guided by ICMPD's 10 issues to look out for in 2023, 10 migration issues, and that was just published this week. But first, when we think back, Jean-Louis and Ralph, where we were a year ago, it was January 2022, and we were discussing the pandemic still. We were in the midst of a big new wave, Omicron, and we were discussing how to get out of the pandemic crisis mode and what was going to lie ahead. A few weeks later, we were all shocked by the unexpected invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which upended any kind of return to normality that we were expecting. And while the long-term consequences of the war in Ukraine are not yet known, of course, the immediate effects have been felt far beyond Europe. The changes in the geopolitical landscape, food insecurity, which was a very sudden challenge and problem facing large parts of Africa and elsewhere in the world, energy scarcity, inflation, and further economic impacts that we are feeling right now that are felt by household in a cost of living crisis that is also going far beyond Europe. Then, of course, not to forget also the extreme weather of summer of 2022, not least the floods, the terrible floods in Pakistan, which also reminded those of us who had temporarily forgotten the many pressing environmental challenges facing us. And last but not least, of course, the big impact of the war, the millions of people fleeing Ukraine and seeking refuge, mainly in Europe. So I would like to begin with that. The biggest event, I would say, in 2022 for the Prague Process region, leading to unprecedented numbers of displaced Ukrainians, triggering also the Temporary Protection Directive and other temporary protection schemes in many host countries. Today, almost 8 million Ukrainians have sought refuge in European countries, and almost 5 million are registered now for temporary protection schemes. We have Poland, Germany, and Czechia as the top 3 destination countries. But of course, per capita, the Czech Republic, Czechia, Poland, and Estonia are the top 3. So my question to you is, of course, to reflect on that big sudden change that happened in 2022, that changed everything, and what should now be on our radar in 2023, because the war is not over yet. We need to stay prepared for potential new waves or or higher numbers of people needing to flee across the border, but at the same time, the participation of Ukrainians in the labor market, empowering those who have fled to be fully in charge of their lives while they're waiting to potentially return. And on that note, thinking about what needs to come next is, of course, also important. I would like to start with you, Ralph, to kick us off with this in mind.
Thank you, Malin, and welcome also from my side to all the participants. Good that for the third time we are not scaring you away we are discussing with Jean-Louis at the beginning of the year. Well, Malin, you've said it all in your introduction. I mean, I think if you want to be short and to look back on the last year, it's very hard to find anything good in what happened last year. And thinking back, indeed, it was January when we discussed last year, when, to be honest with ourselves, we naively, or no one could believe it, that war would be back to Europe. In what we've seen then throughout the last year, with repercussions by the Russian aggression against Ukraine on Europe. And I'm speaking from Brussels, so it's a little bit Eurocentric, Brussels-centric view, but as you pointed out, with truly global repercussions. And thinking back also what we discussed, I think last year, as you said, we were still thinking, and I would say it's even true today in certain parts of the world, that consequences actually of COVID, you pointed to then, I mean, food insecurity, climate, and so on. So we have the structural factors anyway. We have, I think, when you, if I remember well, the general displacement, the global displacement figures put forward by the UN last year, they're in general on going up. So I think in our report, we speak about a sort of polycrisis environment. So one crisis coming not after the other, but on top of the other. So all that we have anyway. In addition, and that is absolutely for, as I said, for Europe, but also for the world, the very sad event which determined everything, what Europe has been put forward in terms of policy for migration, but foreign policy and so on, is then the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So it's really this mixture of, anyway, we have structural challenges, we have still challenges from the past, but in addition, we have the situation and the consequences of what happens from the aggression against Ukraine. Now, I think when we look at the response of last year, I think we have to underline again that the response with regard to what you mentioned in terms of migration terms, or the displacement for Ukrainians, the European response, but also then followed by other countries in Europe with the temporary protection, is, for me, a reaction which probably not everybody expected. Europe stood united, and that was a very strong signal, I think. Looking at the general migration discussions, you know, I think many, as I said, would not have expected that was feasible. As we all know, the Temporary Protection Directive was an instrument which was already half dead and was rather put to the side to be phased out and replaced by something else. But the most important, I think, was the signal that Europe stood united, and also, I mean, mobilizing instrument with a lot of, I'm giving the signal that there is room for flexibility. You referred to numbers. I mean, throughout the whole of last year, I think the issue of numbers has been a very central one. I mean, it is now that we can firmly say there are almost 5 million who have registered for temporary protection. But at the very beginning, it was always, you know, their estimations of how many people crossed the border actually. But very soon already, then came the reports, yes, I mean, through geographic proximity and so on, people are also going back. So this back and forth movement, I think, is something which is actually, I mean, natural in when we have people fleeing. It's not also from other parts of the world. I mean, that is something which is documented and which is known and natural. But here, I think we have an instrument which provides for a framework which, to a certain extent, allows for that. And also that, I think, has been a very strong signal to the Ukrainian people, but also, again, with the other strong signal of standing united, that Europe is serious about it, that Ukraine will not be left alone. And also on this very complicated, normally it's complicated European politics, the migration issue. So for me, I mean, here the answer is really, it's an answer, European answer, which stands out, and I would say will be for sure remembered for the term of this current Commission and Commission plus member states as a quite extraordinary one. Now, you ask, well, you know, this is a bit looking back, now looking ahead. Well, I think one can only work with scenarios, estimations. The number of figures is a crucial one. So there are more things are documented. We have surveys, also intention of people, of what what they want to do, and so on. Now, I think all this can only culminate then in sort of scenario thinking. I mean, from ICMPD, in the report which came out this week. We are saying it can all be between 500,000 and 4 million. Now, is this, it's not to create fears and so on. I mean, if in that paragraph where we put these figures forward, the crucial element is Europe and European member states and administrations and everybody involved has to stay prepared. Because we don't know what will exactly happen. As I said, we also have surveys. We see a lot of Ukrainians, for many reasons, personal reasons, are going back to support families and so on. The longer conflicts last, it has consequences on how much resources people have available and so on. So there are many reasons. So we have the numbers about internally displaced people, which I think is around, according to the UN, around 6 million people. So with all that, I think the key message is it's not over. I mean, administrations, countries have to stay prepared. We have seen in the past it can be very sudden flows when something major happens. At the same time, we also see, I think in the summer was always referred to when winter comes. Very likely that there could be a second major wave. Now, well, we're in the middle of winter. This major second wave is not really happening. So we have to stay prudent, but message, that we have to stay prepared. It's not over, and well, we will continue monitoring the figures. They are crucial to inform policy making. Next step is certainly also, we will soon have the anniversary of the first year of temporary protection directive at European level. There's common agreement that it can be prolonged just in a very fairly simple way for another year. So that is a given, gives a lot of security throughout then for another year in what Ukrainians can count on that this exists. Again, also here, I think that the answer is a quite extraordinary one from the European side. Let me leave it here, and back to you.
Thank you, Ralph. So it sounds like the European Union, Europe is trying to be as prepared as possible. Jean-Louis, what are your thoughts?
First of all, thank you very much for having invited me again to share thoughts with you, and good morning to all participants who are joining us this morning. The way you, Malin, and Ralph introduced our conversation this morning should encourage us to be very modest in terms of outlook or forecast. Ralph, you referred to our conversation or discussion last year. I don't think that the word Ukraine was pronounced once during the 90 minutes that we spent together. Yes, indeed, we are living in unpredictable and changing times. Can we still draw some lessons of what has happened? I like the fact that you use the word polycrisis. Another Brussels-based think tank is using the word permacrisis, but it means the same. And through all this year, I think that one first lesson that I draw is that the European Union has shown that it is remarkably resilient. We being collectively member states, institutions, and populations, we confronted successfully the financial crisis. We confronted rather successfully the pandemic, and the EU response to the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and its consequences is still strong and united. By the same time, we do not manage to get our act together when it comes down to migration as such. There are still diverging views, and we might come back on this later during our conversation today. Looking at Ukraine and focusing on Ukraine, again, I think that you're right, Ralph, and ICMPD is right in warning member states that they have to stand firm and be ready. What can we say? There was last summer a scenario which was played with in many EU capitals that, thanks to, a changing military landscape, which could have led to either a ceasefire or either peace negotiation, one could have envisaged possible returns of Ukraine back to their country in spring of this year. That will obviously not happen. Simultaneously, I tend to share what you just said, Ralph, that should there have been a massive second wave, it would have taken place now, because it's really now that the living conditions are the direst because of, the systematic destruction of energy infrastructure in Ukraine, for instance. And still, those who did not leave Ukraine are still there and are expressing the view that they should remain there. But still, we have to be prepared. Why do we have also to be prepared, we being the member states? Because by the same time, the numbers of other migrants reaching the EU borders are increasing. We are back to the figures of 2015, 2016. What does that mean? It means that the reception capacity of most of the EU member states are now reaching their limits by a combination of standing Ukrainian presence and growing numbers of people arriving regularly or irregularly in EU member states. This, I think, will be for a majority of our member states the 2023 challenge. And with the consequence linked to that, that is to say that we are witnessing in many member states growing differentiation, not to say discrimination, between different categories of persons needing or under protection. This is something that should stay very high on EU member states' radar screen. One thing that we might wish to discuss also further, Malin, you mentioned the economic consequences, amongst other things, on rising prices of food on the food markets, rising prices of energy, although they are going down, of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine. But we should also factor into, and we might come back on that later during our talk this morning, the political consequences. The granting of candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and in the meanwhile, it was also granted to Bosnia. And the opening of European perspective to Georgia should not go unnoticed, because that will also have consequences on the kind of conversation that the EU will have to have with its neighbors when it comes to migration and mobility.
Thank you so much for also taking us into those broader impacts and the political consequences of the war. I think actually what you said is it's a good segue to move into a discussion also on migration trends. You both have mentioned the increases in migration that came already in 2022 and are expected to continue in 2023. I'd like to do a small detour first, just to talk about the impact of the war in another way. The Russians have also been on the move as a consequence of mobilization in Russia, and the Prague process has a really great infographic that gives you a snapshot of that picture from autumn. So that's also something we should keep in mind. It's not only Ukrainians that might be on the move, that are on the move because they are fleeing war, but also there are other consequences on migration and mobility. directly linked to that. But to move to that bigger picture and migration trends and policy responses beyond the war in Ukraine. So yes, I mentioned those elements of what we call a global polycrisis, where we're seeing increasing migration pressures. We saw an increase in irregular border crossings and asylum applications across Europe, but also in other world regions in 2022. And these increases can also partly be attributed to living costs that are increasing, food insecurity, but of course also to climate events and ongoing challenges in various regions of origin. The biggest increases were on the Western Balkan routes and the Central Mediterranean routes when it comes to the routes that connect Europe with the rest of the world. So just to take the conversation a bit onwards, how are our states responding? If we just turn first to the Western Balkans, you mentioned Bosnia before. Maybe we can start with Ralph.
No, indeed, I think it is actually, it is really crucial since, well, Jean-Louis, you have also in your current function a much broader view. Malin, myself, we are very much not stuck, but in this migration discussions and so on. And I think, again, taking Ukraine as the example right now, it is really crucial that we put the migration discussions, see the interconnections with other policy areas, which sometimes is only done by the migration professionals, to achieve migration goals. But here, and you rightly pointed out, to that candidate status was given to Ukraine, Moldova, but then also Bosnia. It should absolutely, it should not only be seen as it's a political signal, absolutely, but then also what does it mean? It can have an influence, and we should not get into a situation that, like messages in the past, when sort of, especially with the Western Balkans, there was a clear sign then from the European Union, we put that a little bit on hold. And then, well, now sort of trying to catch up. So there, the geopolitical consequences very much in the neighborhood of the European Union is really now crucial. And there, the linkages with migration dynamics are very obvious, as we have seen throughout last year, that European Union is immediately impacted. And I think what has happened in the Western Balkans, it's very well documented by media, other reports, and so on, that if a country provides for a certain visa regime, sort of unknown until a given moment, that is exploited by smugglers and so on. People want to move ahead, and the consequences are immediately there. And suddenly you have in the statistics nationalities which for a moment you wonder where they come from, but then it is quite clear. So, and that is being sorted out, I would say, at the moment. I think that was sort of a bit a new phenomenon, what we saw when it comes to the Western Balkans last year. In addition, looking at nationalities, let's say the unresolved situations which have been there for decennies when it comes to Afghanistan, Syria, Tunisia is also again in the focus, not only normally when we speak about Central Mediterranean, it's all about Libya, but Tunisia now much higher on the agenda as source for Tunisians, but also as a country of departure. So we really have here again structural displacement. nationalities on the move further away in Silk Route countries, but also then in the Western Balkans, plus the other nationalities which was a newer phenomenon, very much linked to, as I mentioned, certain visa arrangements by individual countries in the region. I think that was probably the most striking when it comes really to the Western Balkans. Now, from the response of the European Union, I would say, Western Balkans is very much on the agenda of the European Union. There's no doubt at all. I think that is a major change from this Commission, European Commission, to the previous one, in terms of political signal, in terms of support. Also, when it comes then to migration issues, the European Commission will launch very soon major initiatives in the Western Balkan countries, also in the area of migration. But I would like to come also back to one point from an ICMPD point of view. When at the beginning of this commission, so some years ago, we had a beautiful publication where we included one point, and we always advocated that we should not see, let's say, the EU as a closed migration framework, and then we have the Western Balkans. We have to work to a situation where the Western Balkans, before any full membership and all these things in the European Union, are considered, when it comes to migration, as being part of a common migration space. I mean, that is easy to say. We have certain limits. There's Schengen, there's not Schengen, and so on. But Western Balkans is in between, you know, an EU country and other EU countries. So we have the dynamics which sometimes go out of one EU country and then into another, through the region into another EU country. So we really, as ICMPD, have always advocated to consider that as one space when it comes to migration issues, and then to take it from there to, and that is more and more, it is actually happening, to include include the practitioners, the colleagues from the region in all the networks, in the frameworks which exist at EU level, to work into that direction before it comes to any formal membership and so on. But this accompanies absolutely this move towards common standards and so on. You can work already on that before you have a formal membership. Again, then becomes very high political and so on, many considerations. But before we get there, there are many things which can already be done. That there is this practitioners networks, you know, peer-to-peer working, colleagues with colleagues and so on. So I think that is an important point now, since to work into that direction.
Jean, we need a broad framework to consider what is European migration management, but also we need to work beyond that, always with the neighbors of the neighbors, and the neighborhood of the EU is big. You mentioned that already, that there's the political discussion of how to bring people on board, but then there's the other types of cooperation that we still need to nurture and facilitate and consistently invest in order to really address challenges when it comes to irregular movements on these routes. What's your take on what we need to focus on next year?
This is a very important moment of our discussion this morning, and I will follow up on this and answer your question. But let me just backpedal 1 second on Ukraine first and what you said on Russia. One thing is for sure is that these 4 or 5 million Ukrainians who have been welcomed in EU member states are not going to return immediately. They might be back and forth, as you said, Ralph, but I mean, the question that everybody was asking last summer of 2022, are we still in an emergency reception phase, or should we move into a fully fledged integration policy? Implicitly, this question has been answered. It is now about integrating the Ukrainians in the schooling system, in the housing market, in the labor market, facilitating their access to all kinds of public services, including health. While, and I come back to what I said earlier, and I could not stress that more, not creating possible discrimination between the regime which is offered to Ukrainians and the regime which is applicable to other people in need of protection. Second thing, Russians. Good that you mentioned that. One of the silly ideas I launched, or I toyed with during last year, was to ask, but after all, shouldn't we extend temporary protection also to the Russians, putting conscription? After all, why not? It was deemed as, I would say, a politically incorrect question. Fine. But in a way, I regret that this was not further considered, and we can elaborate on that later on. But I lied. the infographics that was shared with us, because it really illustrates what Ralph just said about the role of instances like ICMPD or the Prague process in terms of, I would say, creating fertile ground for further cooperation in the area of mobility management. I will go even further than migration management, mobility management, because once we have, if we remember what we discussed last year in the post-COVID, what would be the post-COVID world, it confronts us with the question of mobility, more than migration. There, I think that a first step would be indeed to nurture exchanges which increase situation awareness, that people get familiar with how the migration or the mobility landscape looks in Central Asia, for instance, and that they do not focus on what is happening at their very border. Nobody was focusing about a migration flow between Ukraine and Poland, for instance, before the war broke out. So I think that this is a crucial contribution that both ICMPD and in particular the Prague process can bring. It does not have short-term, immediate, visible impact, but it helps in preparing for maybe further crisis, but certainly raising situational awareness. Now, indeed, more than ever, we being the EU, we need to, restore, rebuild, reshape our relationship with our neighborhood. For a long time, there was a mantra that EU, you heard about the Brussels effect, you heard about, the EU soft power, and that the most successful external policy of the EU was enlargement stroke neighborhood policy. Clearly, we are not there yet anymore, and we can come back on that later if you so need. So, the EU has now to strike a new balance in its relation with its neighbor. It goes way beyond migration and mobility, but it includes migration and mobility. We need to move to a phase where we have a conversation between adults. And not this kind of posture, which is still too often the one of the EU, or at least of some member states of the EU, which think that they are in a position to lecture their neighbors about what they should do in terms of migration or mobility management. I think that this is a major challenge, a long-term challenge, a mid-term challenge. This will not be answered by the end of this year. And if we have such a policy talks again next year, we don't know. I'm not pleading for it. We might still be there. But this is something that we have to bear in mind. And mobility, I prefer to use the word mobility because it goes way beyond migration, will have to be part of this new way of doing business and having relation between the EU and its neighborhood.
Thank you so much. Mobility is the new way forward. So that will be the key word, both when it comes to Ukrainians that you mentioned before, pendular movements, but also the neighborhood at large. So if that is the leitmotif, that is a good segue to go to another aspect of last year, and that is labor shortages. We tend not to talk about it too much when crisis overshadows what actually is the big part of migration, and that is regular labor migration that happens mostly under the radar when it functions well. But Europe and other parts of the world are seeing big labor shortages and problems on the labor market. And what has happened in 2022 is that a number of at least EU member states have started new discussions or actually concluded new agreements or even migration partnerships bilaterally. So this debate on labor shortages seems to make things move in a new way that we haven't seen before, at least not in that slump of the pandemic where the need of skilled workers was more urgent, but now there seems to be investments in establishing partnerships. So Starting in with you, Ralph, what is your current take on legal migration and mobility, including the policy tools at our disposal from the EU side?
This is my, if you ask me, I mean, this will be structurally for the years to come for European Union countries, but many other countries, even those countries which only partially define themselves as probably destination countries, will be the key migration area in the field of migration where to look at. I mean, the figures are there in all the countries about in which profession we are lacking skills, and skills not any. I mean, we know that. I mean, I would say we know it all in most countries. I mean, high level, mid-level, in whatever structure you are organized in the countries and you do statistics, the result is, the lack of people, but then also the certain, when we speak not about people, but then skills, it's just massive. It's really massive. So I think my observation is, I think in many countries, I mean, we are advancing, that this is, first point is that this has to be, that it is recognized. I mean, it has to be recognized so that it can be addressed. Now, then we also have, clearly to say, that then, migration and immigration is not only the only, it's not only the only answer. You can look into each and every country where it's about upskilling, it's about labor market participation of women, of those who are already in countries. It's about revalorization of certain professions, and so many things. But according to my understanding, what I've read and seen and analysis is, even if we do all that, there are not sufficient people to take care of us, of the way of our living, or the way we're living in European countries. I speak now about European countries, to maintain our living standard, if you wish. So the issue of immigration for labor purposes is absolutely on the is absolutely on the agenda, more, I would say, more than ever. Also for the, not only for the, I mean, it's really for the years to come, needs much more thinking than what is already being done right now. Even though there are great efforts by, for instance, the European Commission to have that on the agenda, to drive the discussion within the European Union forward. We see in certain member states in the European Union, there are legislative changes to allow for easier procedures that this can happen. But the first one is still the recognition that this has to be addressed. Then comes, and I find a very interesting discussion, and you referred also to agreements and so on with potential partner countries to address these shortages. What is that now? Is that then migration policy, or is it labor market policy? Because what we see very often is that when we define it as migration policy and we want to have broader agreements with certain countries because we see a problem in the area of migration, that those countries are not necessarily the countries which, where employers might want to recruit from. If you ask their employers, they will tell you, oh no, I want to work with other countries. So the objective, what we need for the labor market, and to strike, you have an agreement there, and you can work with partner countries. There are many partner countries around the world who have built up their national employment agencies, who say, here, certain professions, we have invested in them. A certain part will stay, stays at home. It's for the national market, but others is more for the international. So there's this notion of the skills partnership, which is out there, and which I would love to see even more support for it, is there. And then there's, the more, when again, us migration practitioners, we look at migration partnerships where labor migration is a part of it to achieve also other objectives in the area of migration, be it return or something else. And there we see very often, a bit conflicting interests, and very often difficulties to upscale, actually. So that tension for me, is very much an unresolved one. And will have to be somehow addressed. But the more the needs are there on the labor markets, I would expect that the more, I mean, employers will make their voice heard and say, well, it's not tomorrow that I need the people, it's now, because it's about competitiveness. And if that is not happening, there are also other options for employers, and that is to relocate, business in there where it's cheaper. And I'm sure, I mean, as European Union, European members said that we don't want to. Now, also just to remind, I mean, it's still the fact that in the European Union, I mean, the question of competence is limited at the European Union level. But I think there the initiative by the European Commission is still, the message is the right one. As a European Union, we want to get also the message across the labor market. We should be working into it's a European Union labor market. We are not there. And Jean-Louis, you know much more about that. You had responsibility in that area. It's a difficult one. Everything on labor markets is difficult. But still, the message should be there. If you come to one EU member state, at some point, whatever conditions are in place, that you could also move on. So it's about attractiveness for talent, and talent is not only highly skilled, it's also medium skilled and so on. So there is initiative, but as I said, the other competence is about how many people can come and so on. I mean, that is very much a national one. And here also, I think what comes again and again to the fore when we speak about concrete schemes or what can be done, it's very much about procedures. Residence permit, working permit, visa, that all that fits together in a streamlined way, quick, so that employers are happy in the end to have the people at the right moment in the right place. It's still a lot of work. But for the future, as I said, linking it to demography, standard of living in the EU in our countries, it will be one of the crucial areas to find the right approaches.
So inevitable that we must also find the right policy balance then to strengthen the union as a whole and only have some healthy competition between member states. Jean-Louis, what do you think about what 2023 and beyond might bring now to are we turning a corner on labor migration? Or
I find myself a lot in the way Ralph put it. And well, by the way, we had several bilateral discussion in official meeting around coffees in Brussels about this issue. This is not a migration policy issue. It is an employment policy issue. It has nothing to do with migration. And we have to stop talking in terms of opening legal channels of migration to gain support of the third countries concerned in trying to control irregular migration. That has nothing to do. That has absolutely nothing to do. We have to get rid of that. Certainly, we need to have a much more balanced relation with countries of origin and transit when it comes to controlling irregular migration, controlling border, facilitating return or readmission, for sure. But the carrots there, if we have to speak in terms of stick and carrots, have nothing to do with employment policy and filling labor shortages. It's an employment policy issue. And indeed, you're right. Ralph, the center of gravity is here within the member states. They are national labor market, and each member state has its own way to meet these labor shortages. By the way, these labor shortages are changing. There is nothing more fluid, mostly in the present circumstances, that national labor market. Sectors in need today might go down the economic drain tomorrow and be, on the contrary, within 6 to 8 months in the situation where they will have to fire people. Look, for instance, at the public work sector in many of our member states. Bear also in mind, and we have to connect the different chapters of our conversation, that the Ukrainians are there. So, they might indeed be an inclination within member states to do what, in a way, Germany did with the Syrians to meet the Wirtschaftswunder of Chancellor Merkel at that time. Ukrainians are there. They are a skilled manpower. They can help fill many of the existing gaps and or labor shortages. So I think that we have to be very prudent when tackling this discussion and trying to link it with migration and mobility issue. Where I would certainly support, I would support most of what Ralph said, but I would certainly support him in, encouraging the EU to show at least more legal openness. What do I mean by that? If you look at the treaty, what the EU competences is limited to set conditions of entry and residence. That's what the EU is able to do. It has nothing to do with figures. It has nothing to do with numbers. It has nothing to do with the profile of, economic migrants. Clearly, the regime which are nowadays in place are still too much control oriented. They are not conducive to, facilitating migration, regular migration, residence, let alone integration, if and when it is deemed to be necessary to fill demographic or labor shortages. The ongoing discussion, for instance, about the draft Commission proposal to upgrade the so-called, residence, integrated labor and residence permit, permit unique, as we say in French. The ongoing difficult discussion shows that we are not there yet. There was indeed a revision of the so-called Green Card Directive, the accelerated scheme for, skilled third country national professional. In all fairness, that revision, that was a success. It took time, but it's still fairly modest. That is indeed, if there is a common understanding amongst member states that the EU has it's to show itself as more open and more attractive in the competition for talents, that is where action could be taken. But managing employment remains a national competence, and therefore using regular or economic migration in the migration debate or discussion with third countries is a no-go.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a conversation we could probably continue for a long time. So how do you then work on cooperation? Ralph, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, it's you see from our comments, we're quite passionate about that. What we said, that you were even clearer, Jean-Louis, which policy areas. When thinking, because that is also, ICMPD, we have always been promoting partnership, and then it comes with agreements and comprehensive partnerships also in the area of migration. I wouldn't totally exclude sort of, that we have in comprehensive migration agreements, migration mobility agreements, something on legal labor migration skills. I think it's it's intelligent to speak more and more than about skills. I think it depends very much with which countries we do cooperate. It can take various forms. It's just about this, if we speak about scale, about really many people, and so on. There it needs connections, it needs cooperation, it needs legislative change, procedures, as we said, and so on. And all that linked to employment policy, labor markets, and so on, that it goes way beyond. But there are certain parts, because I think we have many countries around the world where national employment agencies are not yet able to have the resources to participate in the global labor market and be a central point of entry, let's say. This can already be part of, a wider agreement when we work on migration. So to initiate certain things, to say, okay, it's about skills, hence skills partnerships, or from the Commission, we speak, talent partnerships. All these things that absolutely goes into the right direction. But thinking it further, then I think we are coming to a different dimension in the end, which doesn't fit any more than, let's say, a more limited migration mobility framework, I would say.
So let's be clear, partnerships are always about balancing those interests and needs. And so from a labor market need in the destination country, perhaps we cannot always, it doesn't match, but perhaps there are, as Ralph said, then other needs or priorities in the the other partner state, where we can still include skills or mobility or migration elements to make that a comprehensive partnership. So definitely a discussion that warrants more thought on so-called carrots or how we meet each other's needs in comprehensive partnerships that really work in the long run. Partnerships is also one of the main priorities of the new Pact on Migration and Asylum. In 1 year's time, we'll have the cheat sheet. We'll know what the Commission was able to achieve or not achieve, but it's not that much time left. So what are your predictions of what that cheat sheet might say? Or I know that you don't want to predict or forecast anything, but what's the state of play? Where are we coming from, and what can realistically still happen, or what can we expect or hope for 2023 when it comes to the ongoing Swedish presidency and the incoming Spanish presidency? Ralph, we'll start with you again.
Yeah, well, always these predictions, you can only be wrong, actually. Again, quickly looking back last year. I mean, I think very soon last year, after the temporary protection came into being, I think there was general agreement that this is something very specific, and also, you know, the way it was concluded, or the rapidity and so on, you know, will not have so much of an influence on the general migration discussions and the negotiations of what is called the Pact, the legislation and so on, where we all know it's difficult. Now, there is one element which I find interesting, sort of also throughout then, you know, when the progress, and I think actually the great work of the Czech presidency, I think, and I mentioned it before, that the standing united, I think, has to be realized as being key for the European Union in general, but has also to be realized when it comes to migration issues. Now, in the specific context with regard to Russia, and we haven't even spoken about instrumentalization and these things, but in general, I mean, countries outside the EU know very well about the frictions. In any discord and whatever is so counterproductive and will be exploited. I mean, that has been now seen by everyone for the European Union, to the worst case possible. So the standing united, I had the feeling it came a little bit more actually, you know, as a feature which could help pushing also finding agreement on the other files. Predictions, I mean, there are certain things where progress has been achieved, with the European Parliament now has a key role to play its part to come to agreement. I mean, the essential, and my prediction, to put it that way, is we will see a certain degree of agreement on certain files. Will we see agreement on everything? And especially on the key parts, it's always the key parts then about actually responsibility and sharing. I mean, this what has always been around. I mean, this is, and then to you know, enshrine that into legislation. Will we get there? I hope so. I hope so. I think there is very technical progress and so on, but it needs the political level and readiness also to go into that direction. I think the pressure is clear for everyone. There is sort of the common roadmap between presidencies, European Parliament as the co-legislators in the European Union. We will see progress. Will we go to the, you know, that everything is concluded? That I think it's difficult to have a prediction, but we will have certainly things finalized. I think all parts will make a huge effort that with that mandate of the Commission, there is also success to be shown, and it's absolutely needed. I mean, that is not only to show success, it's needed. Frictions and, you know, this unity on this file, as I said, it's not good for Europe. It will be exploited by whoever wants to exploit it from the outside.
Jean-Louis, what do you think?
Well, again, I mean, I'm pretty much in line with what Ralph just said. I think that actually we're going to have very soon a test which are the conclusions that will be adopted by the European Council, which is meeting early February. Probably reluctantly, the President of the European Council at the last meeting in December had to accept to bring to put migration on the agenda of the European Council. Although the Council had shown remarkable resistance and reluctance to discuss migration for quite some time. Of course, it has many other priorities to deal with. But so migration is back. And the question is, what is the European Council going to say? That, I think, will be the test. From what I understand, there are two schools of thoughts amongst member states. Some of them do share the view that indeed, slowly but surely, thanks to the Czech presidency, now thanks to the Swedish presidency, things are progressing at technical level. And that there is maybe not light at the end of the tunnel, but that there is at least a glimpse of hope. And those fear that a not so well managed debate about chefs on migration could lead to, contrary to what could be expected, could not facilitate, but on the contrary, could have a very negative impact on the ongoing work, by stiffening the positions. Others, indeed, are quite demanding, but they come from very different corners and they come with very different demands, which could hardly be reconciled into even the more diplomatic skilled wording of European Council conclusion. So I think that the test is going to be there. Anytime soon, the Commission will release its letter to the European Council with its proposal. My best guess is that the Commission will reaffirm that the priority should remain the finalization of the negotiation of the pact, with all the uncertainties that Ralph mentioned. But still, I mean, some suggestions for action will have to be made. What can we expect? I'm afraid more of the same. Because, I mean, if indeed the situation is looking like the one we had in 2015, 2016, and until we triggered the temporary protection and until the war broke out in Ukraine, there are not that many new tools in the toolbox. I mean, the agencies are there. So I mean, what kind of new ideas still to be expected? I'm not giving up in the creativity of the Commission officials. What new ideas could the Commission bring to the table that could help, that could reassure member states that efficient action is taken until there is indeed a positive conclusion on the pact? I feel a little bit more of the same, because in all fairness, I think that we have all to agree that all possible plans, action plans, recommendation, the 10-point action plan, the fight against instrumentalization, all that did not deliver. The figures are there. Well, which, by the way, ask some economists to start, induce some economists to start asking the question, but is all that money really well spent? I mean, there are yearly huge amount of money which are spent through the migration funds, through the development funds, the programming of the NDICI, for instance, to supposedly help better dealing with migration and migration flows. Seemingly, I mean, the indicators are not showing a huge success of that policy. So I think that the challenge will be there if indeed the primacy and the priority, of the negotiation of the pact is reaffirmed and supported by member states. What can the EU do and offer on the top of what it has already been doing and offering to face the situation that we were facing in 2022, and there, in terms of forecast, I assume that ICMPD and Ralph will agree on that, will continue or will certainly not improve in 2023. Over to you.
I think in addition, I mean, we speak about the pact and all the elements in the pact and a lot about legislation and so on. I think also now, I mean, this year, I would really like also to see, I mean, there's more progress, let's say, which sometimes goes a little bit unnoticed, but you know, has to advance, will advance, and will very much help in building, I think, also, you know, a ever more unified systems. I mean, first of all, a lot goes through digitalization, and we still have, you know, all the implementation of large-scale IT systems. I mean, it's a major initiative, and again, it generates data, it working together, and so on. I think that is something where, I mean, it continues. It often, I think, goes on, as I said, unnoticed, but is a very important one. Then another one, not to forget, I mean, we ended a little bit last year also with a, I would say, rather a disappointment, and that was the final decision on Schengen enlargement. For me, that is also part, actually, on, let's say, unfinished business. So I'm hopeful that in the course of this year, this can be corrected, and also here we will have, actually, we will see the Schengen enlargement with regard to Romania and Bulgaria, so that can, you know, contribute also to a, you know, unified space with the two countries, and well, but adding sort of to, yes, also the record of this mandate of the Commission plus Schengen. I mean, we haven't spoken so much about Schengen, but, you know, other measures being put in place, but especially the enlargement part, I think, left a little bit of a bad taste at the end of last year.
Thank you. So more of the same, you say, Jean-Louis, and at the same time, Ralph, bringing in also those other aspects. There are a lot of different files at a lot of different levels, and we mustn't forget to look at the full picture of making progress also on some of the things that maybe are smaller files. And the other thing that comes to mind is if maybe there also needs to be some discussions on what success indicators are, what our success criteria are as a whole in the migration policy field. I don't think that there's full common agreement on when we are successful, apart from trying to make conclude the commitments of the pact, which is easier to look at, but then the other elements of how we make progress on migration and how we work with partner countries. We've spent about an hour discussing what to look out for in 2023. And I would now like to open also for questions or comments from the audience.
It's clear that the consequences of the war and the aggression against Ukraine, and as we said, had global consequences. So in general, I think when you think about also repercussions, food crisis, and all these things, I mean, there was actually more attention, even, I think, I mean, at the macro level, probably to Africa. Then when it comes to migration, I think work very much continued. I mean, as I'm just an observer to that, but with regard to the European Union, so Commission with member states defining their priority countries where migration issues should be discussed. I mean, that continues then with action plans. We had at the end of the last year in December, actually a ministerial meeting of one of the migration dialogues in the south, the Rabat process. That was in Spain, so there are also strong political signal and getting everyone together to look at migration issues, very much sort of Europe, North Africa, West Africa, and some parts of Central Africa. Yeah, I mean, it's comparable for those who are not familiar. Sort of, there was a Prague process ministerial meeting early on, and yeah, we ended with the Rabat process ministerial meeting. So also there, on the politic or on the more diplomatic efforts, I think that's clearly on the agenda. And then again, I mean, we have member states in the European Union who look much more south or than necessarily east. So I think it's still quite a balance, and the attention is there. Then Jean-Louis mentioned also funding, or sometimes question on funding, but funding is certainly there as well. I mean, there are the whole programming of many millions, if not billions, that continues as well. West Africa, Central Med, this notion which is now out there, sort of Team Europe, to have everybody around the table also when it comes to implementation. I think that is certainly crucial, not only the dialogue and so on, but that it's implementation. Also that, to my knowledge, has very much continued.
It's an interesting question, if not a crucial one. I think that we have to make a distinction between the big picture and what happens at, I would say, more technical level. At more technical level, I would agree with what Ralph said. For instance, I mean, we facilitated a workshop on remittances and the role of diasporas in the framework of the Rabat and the Khartoum process jointly. And I was impressed preparing that workshop and attending it by the technical progress which is being made to facilitate remittances, increase remittances, and try to, while still acknowledging the fact that it is private money, trying to make them, I mean, more to increase their contribution to, I would say, economic development and well-being of the country of origin of the migrants. This being said, we still have to look at the big picture. At the big picture, I would tend to agree with, I assume, the assumption underlying the question which is in the chat, that is to say that, yes, energy policy, because of Ukraine, went elsewhere. The EU-AU summit of last year, if my memory is correct, was not deemed to be that successful, and at least did not lead to a significant upgrade and improvement of the relation between the EU and Africa. This being said, I think that the challenge there, and I come back to something that both you, Malin, and Ralph hinted at earlier, that the challenge in our relation with Africa is exactly to de-siloize the migration issues. We have a lot of issues to discuss with Africa, starting with climate change, for instance, and the consequences of climate change, and helping African countries and helping some African regions, like the Horn of Africa, for instance, which is going to be devastated by the consequences of climate change, to cope with the consequences of climate change. For instance, I find this new initiative about the so-called Lost and Damaged Fund that was decided upon, at least in principle, at the last COP, a very interesting step forward. But now we're going to have to deliver. We're going to have to put our money where our mouth was. And I come back to something that we discussed earlier about the incentives. I use it myself, the expression stick and carrot, but it's about incentives. It's about rebalancing the relation, in particular with African countries. If we are able to deliver in a decent way in contributing to this Lost and Damaged Fund, if we are able to engage again in an adult conversation with African countries, not lecturing them about how together we could cater for the challenges of climate change and their induced consequences in terms of mobility, security, regional security, conflict, and so on and so forth, that would be the best possible way to create a third high ground for indeed building confidence and then maybe re-entering the classical migration territories, which are, or mobility territories, which are about talent partnership, return, readmission, and so on and so forth. That, I think, would be the challenge for, I mean, rebuilding or reshaping the future relation with Africa.
But I think, I mean, labor market is, or skilling is one thing. I think, and especially with regard to Ukrainians, but also other people, or I mean, who want to join the labor market in the EU in whatever country. And there is a beautiful thing in the European Union, and that is, it's not 27 languages. I forgot now how many official languages we have. It's some 24 or 25, but the different languages we have now for labor markets and getting people into certain professions it's a crucial one, especially when we speak about, in the care sector, health, and so on. So here it's probably part of also the question about skilling, but I think it's not to be forgotten. And we have seen it that, to get people in the labor market, especially from Ukraine, was also then, since the majority, or in many countries, were also women, with children. So it's childcare. So the accompanying measures, actually, which have to be in place. So in addition to when we only speak about, are these the right skills which match the requirements of the labor market, I think then, for me, my understanding that European labor markets are still very sort of we have a lot of rules and the boundaries, where you have to comply with. So there are a lot of hurdles. But as I said, just that as a preliminary comment.
We have to bear in mind that this year is the so-called European Year of Skills. Well, by the way, you might have noticed that last year was the European Year of Youth. It did not come to me as something evident in terms of EU action, but still, we are entering into a new European year, which is the European Year of Skills, to be seen what is going to be done or what could be done in that framework. Concerning the situation of Ukraine, the question is not that much of upskilling or reskilling. The question is very simply a mutual recognition of existing skills. I mean, it happens that for all my sins, I've been involved in several conversations or actions or projects related to the integration into, the Belgian fabric of the 60,000 Ukrainians who have registered under temporary protection in Belgium. I mean, one of the most blatant weakness of this policy is that simply existing skills are not recognized. People who've got diploma from very prestigious Ukrainian university are simply not allowed to practice their, profession, because, their diplomas, their certification is not recognized. Let's start by this. Let's just start by this. I think that mutual recognition of existing and acquired skills is already a first step in the right direction. Again, coming back to the issue of skills, maybe that is something that we could together, ICMPD could inject these kind of concerns into the program of this European Year of Skills. There is a fertile ground. I understand that the issue of skills will be one on which the Commission will organize a public consultation following the model of the Conference on the Future of Europe later this year. So there might be a lot of opportunities to influence the EU agenda when it is about upskilling, reskilling, or mutual recognition of skills.
Very interesting. There's also the notion of, preference for actually probably, EU internal solutions, so internal mobility. But I think when it comes to labor markets, there's also, as far as I know, also that is not easy, and it doesn't necessarily, because even within, and I know it a little bit from the health sector, there are quite a few unsuccessful examples that, you come from one country, you want to go another within the EU, you have your diplomas, but then not only diplomas might then be mutually recognized, but in terms of what are you used to do with that diploma or in that profession in one country is not necessarily the same what you would do in the same profession in another country when it comes to, for instance, nurses or so on. What are you allowed to do, which might lead actually to, quite some deception. And then people say, well, thank you very much, but that's not what I want to do. It's too academic or it's not practical. So internal mobility is also not, let's say, an easy one, which again, I think I said it a little bit earlier. For me, the global labor market or race for talent and so on, it's not an abstract notion. So countries, need as a single entry point, sort of an analysis capacity of what is out there. And if there's interest for the countries of the European Union, that countries from, be it Central Asia or somewhere else, would need the capacity to analyze what, has happening on the labor markets in the European Union. Plus, national employment agencies with an international section to be able to reach out, to make them together with Ministry of Foreign Affairs diplomatic efforts to see if dialogue can happen, to see, that you can have agreements in the direction of labor migration. Sounds all very easy, but that are some, that is certainly necessary as sort of the preconditions when also destination countries look where, with whom they could cooperate.
We have to bear in mind that when dealing with labor shortages, most of the member states do proceed in concentric circle. They first look inside. How can I cater for these labor shortages by reskilling or upskilling my labor workforce? Internal, sectoral, economic, or regional mobility within a said country, within a said national labor market. Then they move to the second broader circle, which is the European circle, because indeed, there is a European preference when it is about seeking for worker, and there are a series of systems like the EURES system, for instance, that are organized at EU level and which are meant to facilitate intra-EU mobility, professionals, economic mobility between EU nationals. One of the key challenges we did not touch upon during our previous discussion would be, but I don't think that the EU and member states are ready to engage on that, would be to facilitate not only mobility of EU national, but more professional mobility of third country national already residing in the EU. That I don't know, a citizen from Ukraine or Moldova or Azerbaijan already residing and working legally in Germany could move easily the day after or tomorrow in the Netherlands and then to Denmark, which is not possible nowadays in the EU. And then, only then comes the, I should say, third circle, which is looking for labor force, experts, talents, call it whatever you want, outside the EU. But that comes only at the end of that process. And indeed, it is said, as a kind of a last option. It is indeed legally the last option. So that's the way it works. And therefore, we said it time and again, Ralph and myself during our exchange. Simply looking at legal migration and legal pathways as a solution to enhance and increase cooperation on migration issues with third countries is a no-go. I don't know, and in any way, I don't like the way the EU is attempting to respond to instrumentalization of migration. I hate the label instrumentalization of migration. It's about human beings. I don't like the answer that was given to the Belarus incident. No, at least the legal answer that was proposed to the Belarus crisis, because the Belarus crisis was sorted out differently. It was sorted out by banging on the head of the airline companies contributing to the trafficking, because it's about trafficking or smuggling of migrants, and having very serious conversations with the countries of origin. That is the way it should be sorted out. We can have serious conversation with Russia in the present circumstances, but we could certainly cater for this with countries of origin where, Russian would go and facilitate the smuggling of migrants, because it is indeed a way of smuggling migrants. And we should not end up in a situation where migrants are actually the victims and victimize them twice. In trying to answer to this so-called hybrid threat, which could be the instrumentalization of migrants. So it was a little bit more complicated than a yes or no answer.
Well, I think it remains an option that we will see these incidents, but at the same time, be it Russia or other countries, have also seen the reaction by the European Union. So I think that also didn't go unnoticed as much as the incidents didn't go unnoticed.
Few things that did come up was that the EU showed last year it is remarkably resilient. The war in Ukraine and other crises are not over, and we have to stay prepared. It's very unpredictable. We don't know what's going to really happen this year. Mobility is a key word for moving forward and thinking about migration. So, and especially mobility for the European region as a whole, not just the EU, but the European political community, if you want, the European neighborhood. So mobility being a way forward, probably not just the leitmotif then for 2023. And that big discussion on labor, migration and labor markets just shows that something is moving also in the public debate and the public discourse on labor shortages and demographic changes, and there's a lot that still needs to be done and discussed with a view to how this plays a role in migration cooperation and migration partnerships. And then we have the unfinished business of the pact, and here the key word was we still need to stand united. Standing united makes Europe strong. Discord makes the EU and Europe vulnerable to exploitation. So the question is whether there will be more of the same, or if we will be creative and find new tools to move forward. Thanks again to both of you for sharing your time with me today. It was a pleasure to moderate this discussion. Thank you to the audience who were with us until the end. Please do participate in the poll so that we know what you thought of the policy talk as well. Have a really nice day.